Cloudinary Image automates the image lifecycle with artificial intelligence. Our unparalleled APIs make visual experiences possible across all devices and touchpoints. To increase conversions, many of our customers easily incorporate user-generated content. Cloudinary Image. Convert shoppers to customers with transformative visual experiences.
And boom, just like that, we have two of my besties. How are you guys doing?
Great.
Yeah, good.
Amazing.
Happy to be here, Henry. Thanks for organizing.
Oh man, you listen, folks, they just came out of a meeting. This is like, they're busy. So I do appreciate their time. I'm going to basically, give you guys a minute to introduce yourselves, and we'll really jump right into it.
I can go first. I'm Annie Sullivan. I was a tech lead of the Speed Metrics team, which developed the Core Web Vitals from 2019. I'm really excited to talk about the history and all the things that happened before. I've been at Google for actually 20 years, and it's been like a big culmination of things together. And I'm just super, super excited to talk with Rick today. I think this is the first time we've been able to talk together about this. Rick was, my manager and mentor, and always really pushing towards the same things that Core Web Vitals wanted. So, Rick.
Yeah, thanks, Annie. Yeah, Rick Byers. I've been on Chrome for 15 years, not at Google, not at Google for as long as Annie has. So I've learned a lot from Annie over the years, and I've had a bunch of different roles. Today, I'm one of Chrome's area tech leads. So I do some tech leadership kind of across all parts of Chrome, web platform type stuff. But during most of the period we were talking about here, I was an engineering manager for our input team and then our performance metrics team. And I was the one arguing, like, hey, this is where we should put staffing. This is where we should add more people. And I was working with Annie and others, on kind of some of the early vision for some of this stuff and the business case for, why do this sort of thing. And then for a while, I was the engineering director for the Blink team. So kind of like the whole core engine of Chromium at Google. And yeah, now I work on a bunch of different things. I still care a lot about performance, of course, but I also work on identity and payments and things like that.
Amazing. I mean, in this little intro right now, I've just learned like a whole bunch. And I was like, no way, I didn't know that. That's amazing. Okay, so we're gonna dive right into it because again, I reached out to Annie originally because we're, I think, having a conversation, and I was like, man, it's coming around to 5 years, et cetera, and I thought it might be interesting to have a conversation about pre-beta, because I know beta launched somewhere around March, May, April, I don't know, something like that, of 2020. But in my head, I was like, man, I'd really be curious about the conversations that took place prior to that, because I've always talked about two particular things. I don't want to take over here, but I just want to sort of set the stage. I remember, I always talk about being booed at Perf Now because I said that, I think we're going to see, and this is pre-Core Vitals, by the way, but I was like, I think we're going to see Lighthouse is going to have some effect on the community. And I mean, I was proven correct, I feel, but the whistling, from the Europeans was a little much. And then, Core Vitals came around, which I felt was like a massive inflection point. So that was 2020. So let's go back to the very initial conversation. Who was having it and what was the discussion?
Yeah, it's hard to, everything builds on the back of others, right? So Annie's been working on performance at Google for longer than I have. So, I don't know what you want to consider the initial conversation, Annie, but maybe you should tell some of the early stories that predate me.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's just this like really long history at Google of like trying to really make the best possible user experience and really focus on performance. It goes back, it predates me for sure, but I remember one of the biggest things that happened kind of in my early career here was in 2008 or 2007-ish. Larry and Sergey went to South America and they tried to access like their Google sites, and a lot of them were really slow, and they came back and they got all the leads in a room and they're like, hey, our mission is to be universally accessible to everyone, and we're really like not helping a huge part of the world, and I want you all to start measuring for real users, how slow is your web app, and to understand not just for you but for your users. And they had us, they tracked what metrics we were following. We had to give quarterly updates and things like that. And I was in charge of the latency for Rightly, which was the old version of Google Docs. And I learned so much and I had so much fun. But I think that really having to be accountable for like, what is the end user seeing was a shift for me. And it's something that when I went to work on Google Search, and that was like super exciting because they were just so deep into that and so great at like really understanding how does a change in search affect the user and how can we make sure that it's good. And then when I came to Chrome, I was just really excited about the ways that we could kind of bring that into the Chrome team. So that's kind of like the long arc that led up to it for me. Rick, what would you say?
There's an interesting connection there. So my involvement, I started working on Chrome, I was actually working on Chrome OS on like the first touchscreen Chromebooks. And so and then we expanded to like touchscreen everywhere, including on Android and whatnot. And we're working on performance. Performance is a big problem. Latency is a big problem with touch. Working on scroll performance and scroll janks and whatnot. And my director at the time kept asking us like, what's your data say? Are we getting faster? And we would show him some data. He'd say, that's crap. I don't believe your data, or that I don't trust that benchmark matters. Now, his background, similar to Annie, he came from the Gmail background, and he had a ton of experience, in particular mobile Gmail, collecting metrics from the wild, and how hard it is to really convince yourself that you understand what's going on for real, right? And so I was so grateful that he had the humility to keep saying, that's not good enough. I don't believe it. And then we would bring some more data, and then he'd say, well, what's this weird change here? Right. And like we spent like a year just trying to get decent scroll performance metrics that we felt we could reason about and that we could measure in the wild, and that when something regressed, we could actually do something about it. And that was really expensive. And luckily we were growing and hiring new people and needed things for them to work on. And we said, look, we can't, we know this is really important to the user experience, to long-term success. So we just kept, having more and more people work in this space. And eventually, once we felt like we'd really actually made some real progress, it's kind of funny. I don't think we solved the scroll performance problem. It's like we still don't have scroll jank in Core Web Vitals, for example. It's hard for a bunch of special reasons. But in parallel, there were folks already working a lot on page load performance. Obviously, lots of people worked on page load performance over the years. But I remember talking to Shubi Paniker, who was working on the first contentful paint specification. And it was it was a small project. There were lots of different ways people were measuring performance. Basically, every team on the Chrome team worked on performance in some way. Many teams did. And whatever way they chose to work on it, they measured in their way. And then when that number went up, they were like, hey, this is good. And I remember chatting with Shubi and some others and saying, what would it take to really go big on this? And I'm always a big fan of amortizing costs, right? Investing in good metrics is hard. Don't do it 100 times. Right? The more we can share costs, the more this can have bigger impact. And in a perfect world, this isn't just about sharing costs within the Chrome team where we have all this fragmentation. It's like all of us together in the web ecosystem. Can't we amortize our costs, pool our resources a little bit more? And so that was, some of the conversations some of us were having early on about what would it take to really go big and make a real dent in the web ecosystem and the performance of the web. And I think I don't remember, some of this was around 2015. We were playing with this stuff. I think maybe by 2017 or something, we'd actually started a Chrome Speed Metrics team. And, there was public threads, we're discussing some of this stuff and trying to take what we learned from FCP and try to make it a bigger deal and have more impact. And then someone did an analysis. I think it was Annie. I don't know if Annie says she doesn't remember. Maybe there was other people at the time, Brian McQuaid and others. But I saw this analysis that suggested, at that point, we'd spent over a decade investing a lot in trying to make Chrome faster, right? And someone showed an analysis of trying to measure the performance of the web as a whole and said, it looks like whenever devices, networks, and browsers get faster, the websites get slower by the exact same amount if you look in aggregate. And that it still to this day gives me goosebumps, because if you know anything about systems theory and reasoning about ecosystems, you're like, oh my goodness, this is the hallmark of a system in dynamic equilibrium, right? it's a first order approximation. It tells you it doesn't matter how much faster we make the browser. The user experience is going to be the same, right? It's like a marketplace with supply and demand, right? You can't just go and say, these bananas are too expensive. Let's lower the prices, right? No, there's actually like an equilibrium that's going on. And so then we started brainstorming, well, what would it take to actually shift the equilibrium? Well, first of all, like we were doing a lot of work to make Chrome faster, but I don't think we were doing a great job at understanding if those performance improvements really stuck or not, right? Sometimes we would make something faster and it would regress and we wouldn't know. And this is where Annie at the time, I think, was working a lot on our own benchmarking system for Chrome. And I remember talking about how like the unsung heroes, in my view, of performance work were the people that prevent regressions. And Annie was a ton of work into preventing regressions for Chrome, and it was hard, right? And it was easy to undervalue because when you do your job perfectly and you do really hard, what is the outcome? Status quo. Right? And so we were trying to shift the culture a lot and say, like, no, we need to invest a lot more in recognizing the value of preventing regressions. And look, if what we understand about the web ecosystem, if this hypothesis is true, that websites are getting slower at the same rate, devices are getting faster. And by the way, I should qualify, that doesn't mean they're getting worse, right? It may be that they're getting slower because the user experience is getting richer and they're adding features. In some cases, certainly anecdotally, that's not the case, right? Some cases, they're just getting slower and they're not getting better in any way. And so, we were brainstorming about, what would it take to actually shift this equilibrium. Anyway, I've rambled for a long time now. There's more stories, but I'm sure we'll get into it all.
So here's a quick question, and I don't want to, get you guys to just sort of lose train of thought here, but you mentioned Shubi Paniker, who I've not seen in ages, by the way, who I loved watching present. And I've just, I'm sure she's on a different team somewhere. So shout outs to Shubi. But
Shubi's actually happily retired. I had lunch with her not too long ago.
Okay. All right. I mean, everyone's retiring now. Did you guys read that CNBC post?
No.
Oh, I'll send it to you. It's funny. Anyhow, so Shubi's happily retired. Congratulations. Now I lost my train of thought.
Sorry.
Oh no, it's fine. Okay, yeah. So she was working on FCP, and you mentioned that things sort of potentially forked from there. Is that what I'm hearing? Like FCP, as she sort of like made a case for it, did the other metrics kind of, eventually evolve from her work doing FCP, sort of like work?
I would say there's a lot of things happening. Like on the loading metrics train, there was this like really long-term arc. I think maybe in 2012 or so, I was working with Tony Janicour and Simon, James Simonson, and they really wanted to basically change the resource prioritization in Chrome, which is really complicated, right? Like Robin Marks gave an awesome talk about it at Perf Now. Lots going on there. And so they were like, well, how are we going to measure this? And they got together with Pat Meenan, and he made an internal web page test. They tried their changes out on 1 million web pages. And we got this really scary result that like the onload metric, which is what we had been measuring in Chrome and what, browsers have measured for, years, sometimes that would move one direction and then speed index would move the other direction. And we were like, oh, wow, like you can't just kind of say like, okay, there's a point in time metric, make it better. It's good enough. We actually really needed a metric that represented the user experience. So we were kind of like grinding at that for loading, right? Like FCP was the first real thing there, but we knew that we needed something that represented like the later experience of like the content being visible. So that's kind of like one arc that was going through. At the same time, the input team was working on making input faster. People were working on animation and scrolling, like Rick said. We wanted to make sure that we're accounting for the rest of the user experience, especially responsiveness to user input. And then around 2017, I think we started thinking about layout shifts as well.
Yeah. And wow. Part of I think what Shubi did early on there is I was just actually going back. I was curious to see. I was looking at when she first proposed shipping the paint timing APIs, and she would always correct people and say FCP, like first paint is not one metric. It's actually a suite of metrics. And she would say like, do you want the absolute first paint? Because that's when we draw a white background. That's not very useful, right? Or do you want the first paint that actually shows some of the web page? That's FCP. And then at the time they had this notion of FMP, first meaningful paint, right? And that was really tough, right? Like, what does it actually mean to be meaningful? And we iterated on a bunch of ideas there. and this is there were folks like Tim Dresser involved at the time, and trying to explore a wide variety and really invest a lot in exploring this landscape and saying, what does it actually take to make a good metric? And there's a bunch of things that we're aiming for, including, first of all, acknowledging that there's no one perfect metric, right? It's you'll get yourself in a trap if you think that way. But if we want something that is useful for the whole web developer community, we also have to optimize for simplicity, right? We have to come up with something. We have a lot more metrics that we use internally, and obviously, sophisticated websites will track all sorts of things that are arguably better for them than the core web vitals. But if you want something that you can rally people around, that you can have one data set and compare, right? Simplicity, I think, really helps. And so that was part of what it went into. We talked for a long time about FCP++. It was like, okay, first Contentful Paint was simple and useful, but it wasn't as useful as we wanted it to be. Too often, the thing that was first contentful was a box or not something that really mattered to the user. And so I think there was a bake-off between like a dozen different FCP++ proposals that tried to weigh these different trade-offs of a good metric. Both something that was meaningful, that was elastic, that that you could improve a little bit and see a win in, and improve a little bit more and see a win in, but also something that developers could understand and reason about. And so that's really, I think, where largest Contentful Paint came out of, was that bake-off. But it took a lot of, there were, several engineers involved for a year at least, if I remember correctly. Annie, you probably remember more of this history than I do.
Yeah, so we had Max was kind of leading the effort, but the paint team like Zinju and PDR were supporting him, and then Nicholas is working on the standards piece of it. But Max actually went and made like a little application. He would do a crawl and take traces of like thousands of websites, and the trace had all the different metrics in it. And you would look at the film strip and say like, well, when they diverge, right? Like, how is last Contentful Paint different from largest Contentful Paint, different from like splitting out text and images? And that was a huge thing to figure out. And then I did some analysis on like, okay, now that we've got all the data on the film strips, let's take all of HTTP archive and say like, how does it correlate to speed index? When is it different or the same than speed index? But there was a lot of work like optimizing the paint engine, understanding like how to make sure we got optimal paint timings, working on a specification, and then analyzing the metrics. So that was just there was a lot to do there.
Yeah. By the way, I realized we skipped an important story that just before this, before we were really trying to get LCP going, Annie was working on the Chrome infrastructure team on Chrome performance. And we were just, chatting and brainstorming and talking about, how we can collectively have more impact and whatnot. And I remember a conversation where I said, Annie, maybe the opportunity is like, what if you think bigger, right? Instead of just making Chrome faster, what if we can make the whole web faster? And I think it was that conversation that got you excited to move and report to me in the web platform team and think like, okay, making Chrome fast isn't a big enough problem for us. Like, let's try to make the web fast. And that's when you joined kind of the speed metrics team that we had. Is there anything else? Is that about right from your memory?
Yeah. And I was just really excited about like using the same metrics across Chrome and the web platform, and like kind of building on all of the energy around Lighthouse and what we've done there, and really moving the ecosystem. I have been a front-end engineer on Google Docs and Google Search, and getting to kind of combine those two things was really exciting for me.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. There's a massive amount of stuff to chew on there. I don't know where to start, but I will start here. And I'm asking for your opinion, or trying to get a temperature check of what was happening internally at Google. So I remember 2, if not 3 conversations, 2 for sure. I was speaking to Felix Arntz, who's on, I don't even know if Galaxy is still around, but Felix Arndt working on WordPress. And I was also speaking with Weston Reuter. I don't know if he was internally at Google, but either way, he was okay on the Galaxy team as well.
Yeah.
They both mentioned their entry into web performance was AMP. And I'm curious to know, because, you talked, Rick, you just mentioned, what if we made the web faster? And part of me feels that this is what AMP was trying to do. Now, the idea of performance is what was the most important part. Now, were the lessons from AMP, but then again, AMP came around 2015. So, were any lessons taken from the AMP experience into what would become eventually Core Vitals?
Yeah, 100%. I've got some fun
Mm.
stories about this. I mean, look, Google's like, I know it can look like Google has infinite resources. There's, even when you get used to the resources you have, it still feels very constrained, right? And so Google's like any other organization. It's tough to prioritize, especially something that's uncertain, like what really is the benefit of performance. And so initially we're able to do a bunch of exploratory work in this space and justify it based on the potential of making the whole web faster. But eventually, like, the business case came down to, okay, who else at Google cares about this problem, right? And I'd actually been working with the AMP team for some time. I believed they were genuine in their mission, trying to make the web a better user experience, and I was trying to help them do that. And I remember I attended an AMP conference. When was that? I think it was February of 2018. And Malte Ubel, who was the tech lead of AMP, and I went out for Chinese dinner after the conference, and we were just chatting about the space for a while, and talking about the value of focusing on objective user experience, right? That you can build a lot more support for an idea if you focus on the outcome rather than focus on use this technology, right? And now, I think AMP, to do something quickly, you often have to be like, oh, do it this way. But we were trying to think longer term, and I was so impressed that he immediately got it. He came from he's been active in the JavaScript community for a long time, JFConf and whatnot, and he was like, oh yeah, of course we should be trying to focus more on objective outcomes rather than on measures. And so he published a blog post like a few weeks after that dinner called "Standardizing Lessons Learned from AMP," where he talks about the importance of paint timing APIs and metrics APIs and how that was like, the long-term future for this class of space. And my favorite anecdote from this time, and I know people have been talking about layout stability problems for a long time, but I still remember because we were talking about AMP wasn't just about trying to make things fast, it was about trying to make them be a great user experience also. And for AMP, it was really critical. This problem of content jumping around when your page load was really critical to them. And I wasn't sure how important it was. I knew page load time was important. That's what I was focused on. But Malte convinced me. And actually, I just took him at his word. He's like, look, AMP needs to solve this layout instability problem. And so we were talking a lot about feature policies and what are the things we can turn off in the web platform to ensure that nothing ever moves around. And then he said to me, you want to hear a dirty secret, Rick? AMP doesn't prevent layout jank. It just makes it highly improbable. And I said, oh, so maybe absolute knobs to prevent layout jank isn't the direction we should be going. Maybe we should be coming up with a metric that measures layout jank and tries to optimize against it. I'm sure others had this idea as well, but that it like we have CLS because layout jank was important to AMP. And I came back from that dinner and asked people to go work on it. And it was kind of a crazy problem. Like we spent, I think, 2 years, Annie, like just dealing with tons and tons of bugs and, lots of feeling of maybe this is too hard to like have a good measure of layout instability. All sorts of ways you might game it or ways it might not actually represent the user experience very well. But to their credit, the team worked really hard on it. We got a ton of great feedback from real people in production, but all the ways that CLS wasn't working for them. And we put a lot of energy into trying to make it better and better. And to be honest, it's one of the things I'm most proud of with Core Web Vitals, because it was non-obvious that was a good thing to do. And you can still debate, but I think to me, that was one of the best things that came. That wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for AMP saying this is non-negotiable for us and we need a solution for layout jank.
Wow. Wow. And I've been trying to get Malte on a stream, and he's super busy over at Vercel, but we had a quick conversation. I was like, dude, I'm reaching out because, again, I've heard 3 people tell me separately AMP was their on-ramp into performance. And again, it's one of these situations where I've just felt outcomes set aside. It's, the culture, it's the idea that, can we think bigger? Can we dream bigger? And it doesn't have to be an immediate success, but it sets a tone.
Absolutely. Yep. And it wasn't just that. There was a lot of other things that came out of AMP. And, I was saying earlier about the prioritization. Once we started making this a partnership between the Chrome team and the search team, now we had more of a business case, right? Once it became like something in search ranking, it's like, like I know Google has a reputation of getting bored of things and walking away from them, right? But once something is like embedded enough into the ecosystem, the developers care about it, and it's part of search ranking, you're not just going to get bored and turn that off, right? So I think that was also really important to sustaining, a pretty significant ongoing investment that we had to sustain to turn it into a real thing.
Wow. So, and I'm just trying to have sort of like a sense of timelines here, because I remember there was a moment where Jake Archibald was always talking about like a janky page. There was a moment and it was like jank, and now all his sort of like, him sharing all that information on socials, I'm having flashbacks. I'm like, oh, is this a result of some of these internal discussions that were taking place and talking about like jank and because I always thought that his discussions led to CLS, but clearly it was a lot more, and you're saying that AMP had a lot of say into what CLS became today.
I think AMP had a big say in that it was a problem that was worth investing a lot in to try to solve.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, not a lot of say into how CLS was implemented. And there, I did look before the talk too. There was talk about layout jank for a long time before
Mm-hmm.
this. Obviously, Jake's been hugely influential in the performance and UX quality world.
Yeah.
And we had, as far as like not layout jank, but performance jank. There's been a lot of other like Rick was talking about on Chrome OS. We want to make everything smooth. We want to make everything smooth on Android. So there's been a ton of other efforts that have inspired that work too.
Mm. And so we definitely got a sense of where LCP came from, the CLS now, and we don't need to spend too much time on it, but when actually I do have another question now. I remember there was a moment where there was a bunch of things like first CPU idle, and all these details, and I was like, what is going on here? And we had like a bunch of metrics, and then a bunch just vanished, like you mentioned. First meaningful
we
paint.
literally did have a bake-off. So I think a lot of people were very, very concerned, right? Especially as Android devices are coming online and iPhones, and they're just, like 10, 15 years ago, not that fast. Like if we make the page loads really fast, then the easy way to do that is just delay all the JavaScript and have this like massive jank, right? Where you're right at the moment when the user's trying to interact. So everybody's like, you have to address this. And like TTI was the first attempt to address it. And I think Rick alluded to some of the problems there. TTI is not very stable. So we had an implementation in Chrome of TTI, and 50% of page loads did not report a TTI at all, just because it's so like the page may never settle, the user may interact before it settles, et cetera. So that was a concern with TTI. And then we had a lot of people coming to us with concerns about TTI that it's too variable. So there's like this 30 millisecond gap or 50 milliseconds. And if you're at like 49 versus 51, TTI will stop or not stop. And that means that you can make some changes and it won't get smaller necessarily. So there's a lot of concerns with TTI. But we were like, we really have to solve this responsiveness problem. And we weren't sure the right way to do that. And I think one of the problems is we did want something that worked well in lab and field, but you can't actually have an interaction in the lab, not reliably. So this was a huge issue for us that we've been working on. And we found we implemented a bunch of field metrics, expected queuing delay, first input delay, overall input delay, like a lot of different field metrics. And then also we implemented a ton of lab metrics. I think we did expected like queuing delay. We did TBT. We did like the total, like the longest long task, a whole bunch of them. And basically what we did was we did a bake-off. Since we have all this Lighthouse data, right? We can see which one is closest to TTI, which one is most elastic, right? If the page changes, then it changes along with the performance. And what matches real users. And at the time, first input delay on mobile, like it was an actual problem back then. That was the worst user input, but that doesn't correspond to a lab metric. And we found that TBT correlated the best. But we had a lot of metric ideas, a lot of design docs going out, a lot of implementations going into the product, and a lot of people really having a strong feeling about which metric is best. So,
and throughout all that, one of the things I was impressed that Annie kept bringing people back to the kind of the human psychology aspect of it. Like, you need to focus on something that matters to users, right? Like, there's always the question of, well, shouldn't we just count JavaScript bytes, for example, right? Or total CPU time or whatever. And that's just like another way of putting ourselves in a position where we're just going to fight, right? If we really want to be scientists about this, we've got to focus on what users are actually observing. So even though like TTI and TBT and FID, they had these limitations, they weren't quite good enough. We knew that FID wasn't good enough when we shipped it. One of the challenges we had with all of this is we knew we wanted people to be able to get data from Chrome through the Crux report, like an anonymized aggregated data. And for our own privacy reasons, that meant that like we had to have enough volume of data for it to be meaningful for enough websites. And that also constrained the design a lot, and we ended up making, honestly, we kind of ran out of time. We're like, we want to launch Core Web Vitals. Let's just pick the best thing we've got right now, which was FID. Right. And we knew it wasn't quite good enough. And sure enough, as pages started to improve and actually got to the point that FID started to become less and less meaningful, right, we had to embark on the work to replace it with IMP, which I think is a much better metric.
Yeah. Wow. And we had already started on IMP like immediately.
Oh, wow. So I'm hearing that the vitals were shipped on a Friday.
We worked on them for like 2 years. At some point, like, I'm a big fan of the idea that, especially in spaces like this, if you really want to be scientific about it, you got to launch and iterate, right? Yeah. You've got to, and there's always a trade-off here, but you can sit and try to design the perfect thing forever, and you'll just never ship anything.
Yeah.
So we felt the same way around CLS, right? Like, it was not clear that CLS was actually going to be net on balance, net useful to people when we shipped it, and we shipped it, and we learned a lot, and we kept investing to make it better and better. And we knew we were going to do that, right? We had this vision. I think at one point we had a vision of every year we would come out with a new cover.
Yeah, we definitely had a yearly update vision, and a lot of our go-to-market teams were like, "Yeah, that's too confusing for developers. They can't do some new initiative every year." And so that was kind of one of the things that we carried. Like, we had meant to simplify the system, but like we didn't realize like it needs to stay very simple. And that was something that continued on after the launch. Big learning.
Absolutely. And again, I'm going to get back to it. I thought, for all the challenges that the performance, like engineers had sort of explaining the details, Lighthouse came with a score, and I was like, oh my God, a score. I understand what this is all about, And then when the vitals came out, same concept, a bit more detailed, or maybe even less detailed, because Lighthouse gave you like a bunch of stuff you might not necessarily understand immediately. But I felt like the vitals were like, bing, bing, bing. Can you get these straightened out? Yes, cool. Let's move on. And obviously you had your little bits that you had to tweak as well. But again, I just think it's one of those inflection points in the space that needed to be discussed, because it did sort of bring out a lot of people, as Erwin talked about. People are like, hey, can you just improve my scores? And they would have these discussions about it. Annie, Rick, this was amazing. I feel like this could have been a 2-hour podcast, easily, because I'd have like so many more questions, but I didn't want to sort of bombard you and have you sort of dig back in history and try to find out who said what, and who was responsible for which metric initiation. But thank you very much for that. I hope folks, first of all, can I get a round of applause for this amazing historical, just explanation of what happened to get the vitals here. Like, I knew something special was taking place. I didn't know what, who, where, but I loved hearing that.
And by the way, we should like elaborate. Like, there was tons of people involved in this, and it wasn't just Google, right? Like, this was a real community movement. And like, part of the reason we kept getting resources from Google to invest in this was because of the developer support we saw. So, so all of you that, blogged about it, or filed bugs, or, gave us feedback, or, and just helped build this as a web community momentum thing, that's probably more important to the success than, any individual thing that Annie or I did. So, thank you to the whole community.
Oh, I'm sure they're very, I see Aaron here, loved hearing all the history. But again, I think that the sort of dinner discussions, that alone, knowing that like a blog post came from a dinner 2 weeks later, a week later, and sort of was able to start to set this tone. Really, really amazing to hear. Someone wants to get in touch with you, has been very impressed. What should they do? Just LinkedIn or personal site?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm rbyers.net on Blue Sky. Still on X as well, if you're not on Blue Sky.
And yourself, Madame Sullivan?
I'm Annie Sully on Blue Sky, AnnieSully.com, Annie Sully on LinkedIn. So
awesome. Well, thank you very much. I know you two are both extremely busy, so I do appreciate the time that you made to share this wonderful story about how things got started with the vitals, core vitals, because that was fantastic, and I wish I could dig in some more. That being said, folks, we're going to get into our next talk. Let's wish these two amazing folks from Google a good rest of day. And Rick, I'm going to see you soon in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, I'm excited to see you in Toronto. I'll be there.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'm not far from you, but I almost never get out to your events in Toronto, so I'm excited to finally make the drive and see you in person.
Awesome, man. I'm looking forward to having you.